All right, so this is us transitioning to the next session. I'm just gonna, for the people that are new joining, I'm just going to make a reference to thanking our sponsors, the Grey Swan Guild. The Guild is a modern virtual think tank that formed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic to help individuals and organizations make sense of the abrupt changes that we continue to experience. In 1 year, the Guild has grown to over 1,000 members in 65 countries who drive focus to Grey Swans. The Guild provides fact-based analysis to support contingency planning for all conceived, predictable, and predicted gray swans. Please help build the Guild by joining us. For more information, join us on the website, which is grayswanguild.org. All right. I am just going to ask you if you would like to introduce yourselves in the chat if you haven't done so already, so that you can hopefully get to know each other. I'll add myself in there as well in case someone ever wants to get to know me. That would be awesome as well. All right, so I'm now going to hand it over to your thought leader, Umran Beba, and her panelist guest to discover how diversity inclusion is not and cannot be a fad, and how it should be a part of the sustainability agenda of a company. And I'm just going to put some contact information for Umran in the chat, so you have it handy if you didn't see it online. So if you want to take it away, Amran, you can just start sharing your screen and it'll turn off my share.
Okay, thank you so much for welcoming me. And this has been definitely an incredible experience, I think, for the ones who have been around 24 hours, still more to go. So I have two of my colleagues here today with me. And first of all, I would like to introduce them actually. Sophia Khan and also Neddy, Neddy Perez. So welcome. And of course, everybody else, welcome, to this session. This is basically a nice group to have a conversation and also challenge each other where we feel, some of the topics are definitely of interest to everybody these days, and diversity inclusion is one of them. So first of all, I would introduce Sophia. Sophia Khan is the VP of Diversity and Inclusion at Thomson Reuters. But before that also, she has been with incredible companies, Medtronic, Wells Fargo, 3M, and of course, PepsiCo. This is my previous company for 25 years, actually. So we have that history. She is based in Greater Minneapolis, St. Paul area. And of course, she's very close to the recent events, as you can imagine. And my other guest today is another friend from the world of diversity and inclusion. Neddy, welcome. Neddy is based in Maryland. She is with McCormick and Company, global head of diversity and inclusion. And before that, again, incredible companies, Ingersoll Rand, Shell, Sodexo, a lifetime diversity and inclusion leader also. My background is more business, HR, and diversity, but my colleagues here, they are actually definitely the lifetimers in this space. So with that, I would like to have a couple of content slides today, and then we will dive into the questions. From the content slides perspective, already, we covered actually two of them. So I will just jump into this one, the sustainability and diversity in the future of work. And I want to explain, why it's important really to talk about the sustainability side of the equation a little bit, because we are always having sometimes knee-jerk reactions to situations, events, things happening around us, external or internal. But if you don't have a plan, if you don't have a long-term plan, unfortunately, they wouldn't make as much sense. So today, that's going to be our conversation with our guests. And my first stop point is going to be about leadership with purpose and how actually purpose is getting integrated into the leadership these days. And throughout the day, I think we heard a lot about purpose. It was important, definitely, for the last 10 years. We have been hearing that, but with the pandemic, what I observe and hear is that now without purpose, companies, organizations, leaders will not attract what they need to attract in terms of talent or customers or consumers. So it's becoming definitely an important aspect. So I will stop here for a minute and go back to my guests. And I would like to understand from them, what does it mean, purpose for you, Sophia, and your organization? And then the same I will ask Neddy. So what does it mean for you, purpose?
Well, first, thanks for having us. I appreciate it. I know Umran, you and I we've crossed paths for a long time. And also just sorry, friends, I have to say Ramadan Mubarak, my sister. So great to be with you. Look, in terms of purpose, it's like purpose and intent, because I've been doing this long enough to see that diversity and inclusion has taken many, many variables, right? It's, there's the things that I would consider table stakes, like representation. That will always matter. Right? That's definitely should not be a passing fancy. But the intent is, why does it matter to, the leaders? Why does it matter to the customer? And why does it matter to the employee? And so you have to really look at the intersection of those things. I think once upon a time in my career, it was diversity inclusion was over here, purely about acquisition of talent. And now it's pulling the thread from an employee life cycle, a customer life cycle, and the underpinning of that is the sustainability of what we do, so that we don't rotate, right? Many of us go to different companies. You heard my background. I've been there and back. and it's because a lot of companies don't know how to sustain this, right? Great companies. So I would say intent and purpose with what is going to be the most meaningful and impactful, right, over time, not just for a short period of time. So I'll just pause there for now.
Yes, thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
Neddy, also, I mean, more than 25 years, you have been in this field of human resources, diversity, inclusion. How would you say for you personally, purpose, and also for the organization you are in?
So I completely agree with everything that Sophia shared. I think it's right on point. I think on a personal level, what we're seeing right now with corporations is that for the Gen Zs, the millennials that are joining corporations, they have to feel that there is a sense of purpose in an organization that aligns with them in order for them to sign up and come to work for those organizations. So I feel that because the population of new employees that are coming into organizations are driving some of the conversation on, we don't want the organization to stay silent on issues that impact the greater community. That sense of purpose that organizations have in the past put out in purpose statements or mission statements or vision statements, and organizations maybe did some things around it to drive home activities or help to make a difference in the community, now is really being challenged. And so those corporations are having to dig in deeper and rethink, what are we really trying to do? How are we going to get things done? And it's not just for employees in one particular part of the country or part of the world. It's how do we holistically redefine for ourselves why we exist, and how do we engage our employees to be able to drive that? And I think once organizations are able to clearly define what are the guidelines of how they're going to operate, then you'll see more employees engaged in supporting that initiative. But employees very quickly will test an organization when they see something like the murders that we've seen in the past with police officers and the Black community, or with how organizations responded to COVID. Some were very intentional about being careful in terms of protecting their employees and reminding employees about safety guidelines, et cetera. But for those companies that didn't even want to talk about COVID in their organization and what steps that they needed to take, that caused distrust. And so it becomes harder to attract talent, becomes harder to soften the message publicly or run a public relations campaign and say, we're really good guys, come join us, when the internal population may not feel that way and is willing to go out to Twitter and to Glassdoor and rate their CEOs on how they're doing in terms of carrying out purpose for their organizations. So I think we're heading into times when corporations will have to be much more attuned than they've ever had to be around why do we exist? How are we carrying out our purpose and mission? And does it align to where our employees want to see us go and where our customers want to see us go? Because a lot of investors are also challenging, what are you doing and how are you showing up to support diversity initiatives? And what are you doing to advance talent within your organization, all the way up to the board of directors?
Yeah, I mean, I actually want to jump into the sustainable impact part of the game. And I mean, I know that most organizations today, I'm just trying to move this forward. Let's see. So I'm kind of stuck for a minute, but anyhow, I will continue talking. The sustainable impact, immediately when we hear about sustainability, it is the ESG, it's environment, it is, you know, the water and the gas emissions and all that stuff. But for you and for your company, do you consider people, diversity, inclusion in this sustainable impact bucket? Sophia, maybe you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, I think that's spot on. I think my entire career, you know, it's always been related to ESG, and which is great, right? And now you're seeing kind of with the UN sustainability goals, you know, SDG 16. I mean, I could name most of them, right? There's this intersectionality, and I know that's the buzzword, the cool word, and I don't mean to overuse it in that way, but what I'm trying to get at is there is this interesting intersectionality between inclusion and diversity of thought with the strategy and sustainability, but to expand it, it's sustainability of the work. Because now we can't go back. I keep saying it over and over with my colleagues, you know, that post May 25th, because I live in Minneapolis, it was a very pivotal moment in my career in this space, that sustainability now is you don't go back, which is number one. Number two, it's what you say you better do.
Yes.
And you better make sure that what you do isn't superfluous, isn't perfunctory, isn't some random thing. Because again, it used to be kind of cool to say, oh, we're D&I and it's the right thing to do, right? It is all about now, you better sustain it because you will lose trust. So I totally agree, Neddy, with, you know, the talent coming in. What I'm finding more and more, it's the talent coming in who's really scrutinizing us, and it's a both and the internal talent and the customer. So for example, we just recently, EcoVadis, which does kind of a significant amount of analysis of companies from a sustainability standpoint and from a procurement standpoint, are challenging companies, including TR, Thomson Reuters, around what are you doing? In order for us to do business with you, you need to complete this survey, you better validate. So you're asking us as vendors, we're asking you as a company. And that is a big shift that I have seen in 18 months. And then secondarily, exactly the external talent coming in, but equally, I would say the talent who is neither early career or neither senior leader, like the bulk and critical mass of the company, is asking, so what's different now? Where are we going? How are you holding people accountable? How are you being more transparent? It's just part of what has to be done. Otherwise, you're just going to have this rotation every 18 to 2 years, you know, of strategy. And I, like I said, you and I, we all know it.
Yeah.
You know, I looked the other day and went, oh, 28 years in my career. Holy crap. You know, and, you know, it's like, just like that. And what has changed? I don't know.
That's an interesting point. And Neddy, yesterday you were mentioning about how many jobs, diversity and inclusion, leadership jobs opened up last year only.
Yeah.
And who did we put in those jobs? You know, what was that craze all of a sudden that, you know, we didn't have these roles in the companies, and then even if we had it, they didn't have a team and they didn't have a budget. But now all of a sudden, you said, and I will leave it to you, the number, but can you just explain a little bit, what was this craze of hiring immediately a lot of diversity leaders into the organizations?
So I think that there are a few things. One is, after George Floyd's murder, the demand inside the organizations for having conversations around diversity shifted. And it was no longer, oh, we have employee ambassador groups or employee resource groups, and they're having monthly activities around heritage months or social activities that were really driven towards maybe community relations efforts. Not that those are bad things, they're good things. However, the deeper conversations that needed to be had have over time kind of gone underground. And so the conversations about how you're moving your talent pipeline, how you are managing succession plans, how you're improving retention, and who is being affected by, the turnover rate and opportunities to advance in the organization were really happening more underground within those employee groups. And so after the murder of George Floyd, you saw within the African-American community or Black community in the US, a huge push for enough is enough. And then the rallying of other groups also saying enough is enough. And so you saw a movement happen almost overnight globally, because it isn't just in the US, it's really around the globe. And so it became clear that there were corporations that did have diversity initiative efforts in place and heads of diversity in place. And those individuals all of a sudden found themselves working almost around the clock to try and put programs out, put out educational materials to help business leaders and managers cope with what was happening, because many didn't know how to have the conversation. A lot of the focus in the past 5-7 years in corporations has been around unconscious bias. And we hadn't really gone back to the original conversations about ethnic diversity, gender diversity, and what are the underpinning challenges in those organizations. Now, for the companies that didn't have a leader in diversity, they found themselves scrambling because they didn't have somebody in their organization that could speak to what was unfolding. So they started posting jobs. And so within a matter of 6 months, there were over 120 jobs posted. And the positions varied from managers to directors to some VPs to some smaller numbers around SVPs. But what was happening was all of a sudden, the individuals that were in jobs and have been doing this work for a while, they started jumping to other companies because they were getting better job offers now. But the bulk of the people being hired into the D&I space don't have an HR background, haven't worked in employee relations or labor relations, so don't understand necessarily all of the other dynamics that are critical to understand in helping to shift the conversation from nice to do events or friendly type of discussions around unconscious bias to actually tackling systemic bias that might exist, which means addressing or editing or revisiting policies and processes that prevent people from advancing, or prevent people from being able to declare that they might have a disability, or helping individuals within the organization to advance through the talent management process of the organization. And so a lot of the folks that are coming in don't necessarily have the backgrounds of those systemic changes that need to happen within the organization. After those first 6 months, you saw still more jobs being posted, but the same thing was happening. The individuals being selected were coming from business or maybe from legal or coming in from another aspect of an organization, but not necessarily being grounded in learning systems or employee relations or labor relations, or ones that necessarily had diversity backgrounds. And then the third part of that is a lot of the positions that were being created initially because they were knee-jerk reactions to what was happening and the need to put in what I call a stopgap and help the corporation have some kind of response. A lot of those positions were not being funded. So you might be hired in as a VP or as a director, but you're the only person leading that effort. So there are no resources, there is no budget attached to it, which means that those individuals that might have good intentions, willing to set things up properly, won't have the resources that they need to be able to execute. So I think there's a telltale time over the course of the next 2 to 3 years on whether or not the companies that moved so quickly to create a job are really going to keep those roles, and whether or not the conversations that have been unfolding with regards to George Floyd and even with the recent Asian hate crimes that have been happening, how those will continue to be managed and addressed within the corporations. So I think we're heading for some kind of disalignment and almost a pullback on some of the efforts if corporations don't really have those deeper conversations on why are we doing this? How do we make sure that what we're doing is not short term, not a quick fix, but really a long-term initiative and part of our business strategy, not just part of a program that we're launching.
I mean, at this point, I want to bring in our first kind of quote-like statement. So every company is trying to maybe hire this miracle person, right, who will come and fix all the problems you described. And you have been in those positions, you know, all of us. But at the end, is this a one-person deal or is this a everybody deal? Is it an everybody matters deal? Just tell me a little bit, Sophia, how do you see it?
I wish I was a miracle worker. My goodness, I would definitely be. But look, I think at the end of the day, you know, I think much like Neddy and Umran, you've shared in our prior conversations, you have to have a systemic approach to this. You know, it can't just be we have a policy, we have a strategy, you know, and then boom, boom, here are our pillars, right? A lot has changed where I think it's not the size of the team. You know, most of my diversity inclusion teams that I've led have not been that big. You know, I've had one person, I've had 5. I think the most I've ever had is 5 when I was at Medtronic. I think what matters is how you deploy, how the accountability. So to me, there's some irrefutable levers, you know, if you will. And it's, you know, kind of really having, it's not just tone at the top and have the CEO sign the right document. It is, what is the accountability? So one aspect of accountability is goals, right? Representation goals and disaggregating those goals. So it's not just, oh, we need female representation, for example. It's, I tend to then disaggregate it and say, yeah, but when you look at women, you can't homogenize women. We're not all the same, right? And, you know, in organizations, you have more white women who are progressing than women of color, okay? And so it's important to tell the truth, but do it through the data, do it with, you know, each leader and their leadership team. So you're building the transparency. It's not about shame and all this stuff, but it's what's your baseline. So that's, and the same thing with the customer base. Where are the customers? What do they want? What are their expectations? You know, they're putting a lot of pressure on us to be representative of them and expand their portfolio. So I guess, you know, for me, it's a systemic approach. It is, yes, it's collaboration, but it's way more than collaboration, right? We can all work together on a project and execute it, but it's, what is that leader held accountable for monthly, quarterly, mid-year, year-end? How are you embedding the accountability in everything that we do? So it's not just about the representation, it's representation and, to your point, Neddy, around the whole talent management process, right? Because most executives are only doing succession planning at director and above, VP and above. That's great, but there's an entire population of talent that needs to be paid attention to. And that's kind of where I go, is I work kind of all these different angles to build the accountability and make sure that it isn't just a tick off the box, you know, go, oh, great, no, we didn't make the goal. Oh, and my thing is, okay, but if it's a business goal, you would never let someone off the hook, would you?
Yeah.
No. So why would we do that here? And so I'm really adamant, as you can tell, about really zoning in on the full spectrum of leadership, and that diversity inclusion is part of that, not adjacent to it.
Now, I will stop for a minute and ask our, you know, guests and audience here if you have any questions, any remarks, any surprises. Daniel, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, and in case I'm jumping the gun, I apologize. But building on Sophia's point, which was where I was going, are you finding these days that, using the reference, you know, cart before the horse, are you finding that organizations are maturing enough in the objective not only to align to business goals, but putting the absolute goal of inclusive environment, culture, and overall employee experience ahead of checking the boxes, because usually the practice is to try to check the boxes and focus on the diversity without creating the platform or the culture. And that's why a lot of those initiatives fail, regardless of how talented or visionary the leadership team driving the initiative is. And I've been on the other side of the equation a long time ago, but I'm interested as to what you're seeing as experts in this space.
No, great question. If I'll just answer it real quick, and then obviously I want to hear from my other colleagues. But I would say, to me, we say diversity, inclusion. To me, sometimes I reverse it and say inclusion and diversity for a reason. And in fact, I often say, inclusion is the antecedent to diversity. Like you can fill your pipeline, you can hire, you can do all these great things, right? But nothing has changed. I'm just being honest. I don't care what company, what industry. I've been all over the place. I am very connected to my colleagues, right? And you get some progress, but then it just flatlines. And I think it's because we're not paying attention to the culture. And again, the culture, not just of belonging, but of the decisions that are being made on the talent and the progression of the talent through the pipeline, right? So you can have the best culture in the world, but if you still don't see someone like you, or you still don't feel there's actual real representation, what good is it, right? There's great cultures, but there's just something missing in the connection and the pull through. So the culture matters, but it has to be a both end. Yeah. But Neddy, please, I'd love to hear a divergent perspective here.
No, I think you're completely right. I have not really seen that much change in the 20-something years I've been in this space. And I think even more so over the course of the last year, I think there's a lot more attention and focus on the conversation around race and ethnicity right now because of everything that's happened and what still seems to be unfolding in different parts of the country. I tend to worry that organizations are not weaving diversity and inclusion throughout the whole organization, the ecosystem of the organization. And what I mean by that is when you're talking about diversity and inclusion, it's not just about the talent, but what are the policies, what are the processes that create an inclusive environment? If I have something happen to me in the organization, am I able to connect with the right people to help me address the issue? Those kinds of things and conversations aren't going deep enough in the organization. And then the other piece to Sophia's comment, which was accountability. Leadership accountability does matter. I've always been a believer that the diversity inclusion strategy needs to be embedded as an element of the overall business strategy and linked to the human resources strategy. Not create a separate D&I scorecard, but rather have D&I be part of the business scorecard in order to really drive organizational change. And where we see failure in a lot of companies, especially when they start to switch every 2 to 3 years D&I officers, is because the systems, the level of accountability in the organization hasn't gone deep enough. And either that leader gets frustrated and they move on to the next company, or the organization doesn't understand and haven't been educated enough to be able to create and embed D&I into their organization. And so I think there is a piece around accountability, definitely embedding D&I and weaving it through social responsibility, legal, through compliance, through the HR function, through the business function, and through even the financial compensation aspects of the organization in terms of how do we reward leaders? How do they get their bonuses? Those kinds of things.
I think if I can add just one quick thing, because I love what you said. I think it's when I talk about systemic and intersectionality, I mean, pick your word, right? But I think Daniel, to your question, to kind of expand a little bit too, is when we think about something systemic, I mean, the culture matters, okay, will always matter. However, I have found, I challenge myself, how much of the culture has actually influenced the representation of diversity? I don't know. I'm not sure, because all these companies we've been at have brilliant cultures, amazing people, but there's something missing. And so what I've had to do is really distill it down to kind of democratize the approach on decision making. Because what is universal is a lot of us make decisions and a lot of us are recipients of decisions.
Yes.
So within the decision process, when you talk about culture, I looked at it prior to the experience of how we make decisions. And where's the bias in that, right? I honestly, I even simplify it further. And I just told a leader yesterday, I said, you know what? I need you to hit pause for 30 seconds before you open your mouth. Because I love what you said the first time. And then you kept going. And I went, hey, I'm not trying to control the leader, but I'm like, your good intention just got lost and created a frenzy that was totally unnecessary.
Yeah.
So your passion is great, but your passion isn't enough. I love your passion, but I need action, right? So the decision-making component, I would say, is where I really spent a lot of time over the past probably 5 years with my leaders, and then kind of across the organization, because that is something that unifies us at the end of the day. So I just kind of wanted to share that.
Yeah.
You know, one last thing I'll just share is, you know, you think about how do you get change? Well, look at what you're documenting. So when you post a role, ask yourself next time, is this job just what we've always expected? And we just kind of take the corporate template and then we add what we want? Because that is not sufficient anymore. It's most job descriptions, and there's tons of research, is centered on the cis white male. And so that is not really representative of the workforce. So inherently there's bias in the job description to begin with.
Yes.
And then it goes down to the selection. So again, that kind of relates to culture. Is like, what are we perpetuating, right? What's happening here? So I just kind of wanted to share a little bit of like real time what you can do, but also how to approach decision making.
Yeah. No, I think the whole idea of, scorecard, business scorecard, manager scorecard, and integrating all these representation goals, but inclusion index, belonging index, whatever we want to call it, I think becomes so critical. And at that point, I am having another attempt to go back to my scorecard stuff.
I believe in you.
Yes. So now I have the whole sustainability thing here. And I will make this. Why is it going back to this chart again? Anyhow, let's keep it like this. Okay, let's not make it. But in the sustainability, there is always this environment and future. And as you mentioned, there are goals now around carbon emissions,
Yes.
water, waste. I mean, it's very clear. Everybody is putting those goals out. And when you come to the people, you already mentioned, you know, the people side of the equation. We start seeing, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion goals, human rights goals, community goals. And under the diversity, equity, inclusion, you mentioned already, you know, there is the representation. We cannot forget about it. But there is also pay equity, which I want to also refer to that. There is community support. There is a lot of now dollars, you know, millions of dollars actually put last year, in the last 1 year out there on that topic. So I want to ask you at this point, you know, originally these budgets were not there. They were not part of the, let's say, your scorecard. But somehow organizations managed to find the money. I mean, that's very interesting. You know, they found either, I don't know, 50 million, 100 million, 400 million. I mean, it's really like incredible amounts of numbers. So I'm afraid, honestly, that it will be for 1 year or two, and then we will go back to another topic, which might be the water next time, or which might be the gas. I mean, like, it can be anything else. So that's the worry I have. So how sustainable are these commitments? And Neddy, I want to ask you, you know, I'm sure you have been in these situations where many commitments are happening. You find, or somebody finds the money in the organization, how sustainable they are.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fantastic question that you're asking. I think that what we're seeing right now is a lot of companies still scrambling to figure out how they want to show up in the public eye. And so they're not necessarily asking, and this goes back to the purpose and intent, you know, question that you asked at the beginning. What drives us as an organization? And what are we committed to doing in the long run? I know that our own CEO was ready to publish commitments, and we had some conversations with the management committee, with our board of directors. And so we did, we published some commitments. Some of it had some dollars attached to it. We were very clear in defining the scope of the dollars and the purpose of those dollars and what those commitments were intended to accomplish for the company. But we looked at what's our purpose statement, where are we looking to put our dollars, how are we going to go about making decisions about where those dollars go. So we engaged our employees so that they had an opportunity to provide some input on where the dollars are going. We didn't go out and create or find, new dollars that we were going to commit to. What we did do was look at what we were already doing and ask ourselves the question, are these the right places that we need to be in? Or do we need to shift where we've been investing? And so from there, then we looked at, okay, what are the dollars that are available? And how do we engage our employees in the decision-making to make sure that there's alignment? Some dollars were already predetermined of commitments that the company had made that are much bigger, broader, long-term, such as our, effort around carbon footprint and becoming a self-sufficient energy organization. Those things we weren't going to touch because they're true for the future of the company and the well-being of the earth, right? But from an inclusion perspective, where are existing dollars that maybe aren't being utilized in a way that we thought would be effective? And so that's where we then came up with a pool of dollars that we could commit to. And then we engaged our employees for their feedback on where those dollars should be directed, which helped our employees, it helped our community, helped our investors feel much better about the organization. And we are a fairly conservative organization, so we didn't make those commitments of $100 million or $50 million. We really looked at what could we do long-term, because we want to make sure that what we're investing in is something that is going to help the company, help the employees, help our customers in the long term, not just an immediate. I think right now, some companies are still looking at and scrambling for what do we do now in order to improve their image in the public eye.
Yeah,
If I can just say, I think what you just said about sustainability in this context of whether it's through your foundation, philanthropy, whatever avenue it is exactly what you said, because it's planting the seed for the long term. This is another aspect of sustainability versus, and it's great. Listen, it's great that my friends at Target and everywhere else, all my friends over there, right? It's part of just who they are and their presence in the market. It's very different for our Thomson Reuters. We give, just like most companies, millions and millions of dollars. But for us, it was when it came to social justice or racial equity or communities in need, it was an immediate, how can we build bridges and help local businesses in the places where we're located, start to develop and cultivate their relationships in the community, build some kind of a foundation so that other companies can join and contribute. So it wasn't just, look at Thomson Reuters, we're going to put our badge on, XYZ local company or a Black-owned company. It was, no, we're going to get a collaboration or a collective together and all together supported. And so I know in Minnesota, we have a racial equity coalition.
Yes.
With, all the companies, because this is much larger than what TR can contribute, right? Yeah. So you're also seeing a shift, I would say, we're all competitive, but I mean, less competition with my neighboring company and more collaboration, which is definitely a sustainability angle that is much needed.
Well, and so along those lines, Sophia, I've always worked off of a model called VIC, right? Volunteer, in kind, and cash. And so immediately companies turn to, can I, make a financial donation? But sometimes that in-kind contribution carries more weight than the cash donation.
Yes.
And then in terms of volunteers, a lot of our employee ambassador groups or employee resource groups or business resource groups, however they're called within the organization, that are extensions of the diversity efforts, oftentimes have relationships in the community with projects or initiatives are being worked on. but a great way to engage your employees as volunteers on those projects and initiatives to connect with community causes that are going to have a greater impact. And oftentimes we forget that, but if you look at what can we do for the long haul, how is this partnership going to align with us for the future? And where can we make a donation? Where can we engage in maybe opening up our facilities and letting them be used by a community organization as a space to have dialogue, which then benefits other employees in the organization? Or can we leverage our existing employee base to be volunteers in the local community? And what are the existing nonprofits that we are affiliated with or associations that we can pool our resources with to have a greater impact? And I think there are a lot more companies now looking at that. To your point, it's become less competitive of I'm going to put in dollars and really promote my own company, but rather it's I'm going to put in my dollars. What if you put in your dollars? We can be more successful together and have a greater impact on our local community. So I think it's shifting.
Yeah. That's a real positive, actually, what you mentioned. And Lori, you have a lot of great comments in the chat box. Would you like to come in and either ask a question or say something?
Well, I think the sort of patriarchal way that business has been run in the past is challenging the colonization, the way that our businesses, where they came from to where they are now, is a challenge. But with that said, there is a lot of data and proof that the diversity, inclusion, and equity and equality are beneficial to businesses and beneficial to organizations financially, economically, in the ecosystem. And I'm just trying to understand and figure out why it's not more mainstream already.
That's a deep question.
I have some thoughts on that. I'd have to be off the record, my friend, but I don't know. Umran, you want to take that one first and then?
I mean, we talked about it yesterday, but why don't you go ahead? Yes, go ahead.
I mean, look, at the end of the day, without getting into a history lesson, right?
Yeah.
The systems are set up, the systems that were set up when, whether it's the United States, we can talk about post-colonial, pre-colonial, I mean, you name it, right? The way they were set up were not set up for everybody.
Yeah.
Right? They were set up in a particular, and this is an uncomfortable thing because I know a lot of my white male friends that might be listening to this call. This is not alienating you. So I want to really preface it with, I'm just speaking the truth of just what exists. So the systems and the way decisions were made, or the way we view leadership to this day, right, is still like, you're not going to look at me and think I'm a leader. But so I've been in a room where I might have just for example, someone next to me who's white male or white female, and they will defer to that person. And then I've been asked to get coffee, or I've been asked to like, hey, do you have a pen? Could you get some more pens for the room? So we still have this paradigm of what you see and what you expect visibly, and then layer it with all this complexity of why the systems are set up the way that they are. And nobody has really had to challenge them. Secondly, you have a scarcity kind of mode that I find a lot of fear in this space, that if you get, I lose out, right? And there's a lot of this us versus them and the scarcity model that has also been set up, that it is not a you get, I don't get. It just isn't. And I can go into statistics because believe me, I'm a math geek here. I mean, I look at stats, I look at data, and I help our leaders. And I said this just recently. I said, with all due respect, the white male is not losing out, and the white female is not losing on a role just because I get promoted. And I'm saying things that are maybe uncomfortable, and you may not like, and you may tune out, but this is the kind of reality of conversation we have to have in order to understand the systems in place that have created the decision-making trees that we use. Pick your topic: customer selection, who gets what book of business, right? A lot of minority individuals in sales are not getting the books of business. And I can tell you across the board, I see this. Why? Is it because the person hiring them is racist? No, it's because there's something ingrained in the system and the way we select and fit for role, fit for whatever it is. So I will stop there, but I think, as you can tell, this is something that I've had and I've spent years trying to unpack and do it in a productive way for change.
And we talked about retention also, Neddy, yesterday. I mean, this whole recruitment effort is excellent, but then, you know, what's going on with the retention, the pay equity,
Yes.
inclusive environment, all that stuff.
Mhm.
What would you say on that?
No, you're right on point. I thought Sophia's response was excellent. So I think there's a lot of hidden losses that we don't talk about when we talk about diversity and inclusion. And so yesterday when we were having our chat, the three of us, I brought up the fact that a lot of companies will invest upfront on hiring people, and they'll put in advertising, they'll go out and join different websites and have events to hire people. They come in, but the culture itself may not be the right fit for the individual. And that individual within 6 months to maybe a year or two decides, I can no longer grow here, or I don't feel I'm going to be able to grow, and they leave. The upfront cost, and I think it was E&Y that did a study a few years ago, showed that for every individual hired, provided they were at $100,000 at the point of hire, when that individual gets ready to leave the organization within 1 or 2 years of being with the organization, you're not just losing that $100,000 investment initially made in finding that candidate, you're losing 2 to 3 times the total investment of having groomed that person, put in training and development, and the after effect of why that person left. If they were an employee that was unhappy, or they had a situation that they were unhappy with, they will go out and tell other people. And so it goes back to advertising, right? If you don't do a good job around the advertising, you sell a product that looks so good, but the employee or the individual buys the product and they don't feel so good about it, they're not just going to tell one person, they're going to tell 7 other people that that particular product wasn't good. So at the end of the day, an organization may have hidden costs that they're not taking into consideration when they go out and spend money in terms of hiring diverse candidates. And even though they've spent that money, they may not have a fertile environment to create inclusion that allows that person to want to stay. I was sitting in on the Catalyst presentation earlier, and I thought it was fantastic. I myself think I am a catalyst, but one of the things that I found really interesting is individuals that have really good ideas that could be drivers of change of the organization, they'll keep trying, but at a certain point, they are going to stop trying. And those are the individuals that are more likely to leave sooner because they don't feel there's any value for them in the organization when they're not being considered or when their ideas aren't being embraced. And if you're coming from an organization like a Google and you're going into an organization that's highly conservative, that individual is going to not feel valued because they don't have the same level of creativity and or aren't being turned to and asked, what do you think? So there's a great book called The Penguin and the Peacock. And I read this, it was written by Roosevelt Thomas. When the first time I read that book, I was like, oh my gosh, I am a peacock trying to fit into a penguin. I cannot stay in this organization. I was working for a large transportation logistics company at the time. And I realized that I kept trying to fit myself into the uniform of operation. And I was bucking the system. I was coming up with creative ideas. On one hand, I was being recognized, but on the other hand, I wasn't. And I realized if I don't leave now, my soul is going to die. And so I ended up leaving and went to an organization that was an energy sector organization that welcomed innovation and new concepts and wanted me to push the button and was supportive of that. And so, yeah, I think you run into people all of the time in our companies that are trying to fit into the uniform of the culture of the organization. But then we ask ourselves, why did they leave? And that is not only impact in the cost of the investment to retain that person, but the potential ideas that that person could have brought to the table that could have had millions of dollars of impact in the organization. So
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we have Canadian friends here, right? So, of course, they maybe see a different side of the diversity inclusion equation versus US. But if there is any question or comment from the Canadian community, I will also appreciate that.
I was going to say, I would love that because I work for a Canadian company. So
Yeah.
Thomson Reuters is based in Toronto, global, but, and if I will just add that just for a moment, since you mentioned Canada, you know, it's fascinating because there's always this thing, oh, the Canada does it better, the US doesn't, you know, this is all this fun thing. One of the things I have found though is, you know, even in Canada, if I may say, so one of the projects we worked on, when you talk about culture, people came, my friend Daniel over there, you know, culture or inclusion and these kinds of pieces is, do you know who's at the company? So one of the things that we did over the past 6 months is significant research to look at, you know, all employees can voluntarily self-ID, meaning how you see yourself. Are you, whether it's your ethnicity, your gender, your orientation, disability, veteran status, right? Like we've got all these things and it's voluntary. And it's not just about tick the box. What we're trying to do is expand by each country. So over 120 countries we looked at, how can we expand our fields to be more inclusive? Because if I don't know, let's just say me, if I'm working on a policy or we're working on a customer, you know, trying to procure maybe a new customer or a product or, you know, whatever it is, how are we going to eliminate the bias or build innovation or do exactly what we're talking about if we don't know who's at the company? So what's interesting with Canada, for example, visible minority is kind of the homogenous way to look at, and I mean, just no disrespect, but homogenous way to look at race and ethnicity. And we said that's not sufficient enough because how do I know where our Black talent is or Asian talent, like if it's just visible minority? Now that's a country kind of census thing, but we decided to break it down actually and fight that a little bit because to say that's not right. I don't know what that means. And our Black talent in particular said, I'm not just a visible minority, I'm much more than that. So as cool as that seems, it isn't sufficient. So when I talk about systems and systemic thinking, it's also, do we know who's at the company? Because again, that could impact benefits. We've got to push our benefits vendors because if you think about it, for example, when your employees select benefits, it's male, female. That's what the insurance companies use. They don't look at any other designations, and that's actually wrong. No disrespect to any friends in insurance, but I fight that kind of fight around, you know, if you're going to talk about inclusion, the benefits, and you talk about new employees, what benefits are we providing?
It's becoming case by case, right?
Yeah.
So every time you have to dive in and solve that specific case, which is not ideal. So as we are approaching actually to the end
of our... I see a hand raised though, Umran.
Oh, where is the hand?
Is it Uma?
Uma.
Yes, please, Uma, go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, I'm sorry. I joined late and I don't know if this has been discussed, but also from a Canadian perspective, if I can just give my thoughts on what I think a successful diversity and inclusion strategy is, and for it to be sustainable. So I used to work for 2 large financial institutions in Toronto, and they were pretty big on diversity, and they've been recognized by Catalyst for their diversity and inclusion efforts. And what I think is would make an organization successful is if it's sort of embedded in different areas. So if you were to take like a change management model, so there has to be leadership support. So from the top, but also from the bottom. So whether it's employee resource groups, because then it really, so the leadership may put it on the radar, but the employee resource groups, they actually keep it there and keep the attention going. And then once the attention, for diversity and inclusion becomes more and more, I don't know what's the word, needed in the organization, then you start embedding it in sort of like the management practices. So perhaps, ensuring that your recruitment takes diversity and inclusion into account. So I, even at one of the banks that I worked with, there was one executive who actually made it mandatory that each of his executives under him, they had to demonstrate some sort of diversity and inclusion competency or something that they had done for their division, and that factored into their performance. So so it has to be sort of embedded in different areas. And because it was a bank, their thing was about making money. So they also try to embed it in their strategies into attracting different customers, and to ensure that, you know, okay, for persons with disabilities, their services were, you know, they were accessible and that sort of thing. And their advertisements spoke to the different communities that that they were there. And underpinning all of that was the measurement aspect. Like, you know, they say what, I can't remember the saying, but it was all
What
about
gets
reporting.
measured gets done.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we're also, I think also in the US, there is a certain type of reporting that you have to do for the government. Well, also there is employment equity in Canada, which keeps companies here, whether they're federally regulated or provincially regulated, they have to meet certain criteria and demonstrate progress. So I guess my point, so and then finally, when all of this comes together, you actually see, whether it's from an employee perspective, people wanting to work for that organization because diversity and inclusion is so much in their face, and customers actually wanting to do business with that organization. So there is a money aspect to it, and that's really what makes it become sustainable. So so I think from well, based on what what was successful, I think in the two organizations that I work for, that's an option for people to think about.
Thank you. Thank you. So I just want to say, you know, this is a long-term, global, and integrated agenda. It's not a fad, or it's not a fashion, or it's not a knee-jerk reaction. Sophia and Neddy, I will need your one quote to end this session, and then I will pass the baton to our next speaker with Lori. Okay, so Sophia, what's your one final quote?
Wow. You know, at the end of the day, I guess my mantra is always that this is the work of all.
Yeah, yeah. And Neddy?
I think I think it was said the best a few minutes ago, what gets done actually gets measured, or I'm sorry, what gets measured is what gets done. At the end of the day, with regards to D&I, you have to build the initiatives into the holistic systems of the organization and make sure you're measuring them in order to drive change in the organization. It's not going to happen overnight, but if you don't measure it, it won't happen at all.
Thank you so much for joining me. You know, wonderful, wonderful experiences, thoughts here. And also I would like to thank Jill for this wonderful background. I might steal and use it somewhere else. The colors are beautiful. And also thanks to Lori for, you know, managing or being the captain, as well as Swan Guild team. Thanks for inviting us to this session. So all the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Good to be with you.
Thank you for coming and participating. I think that the conversation was very stimulating. If you're not a member of the Guild, please consider joining us, and you can provide feedback to the Day of the Swan at the website there. And we have a pretty vibrant community on Clubhouse, so you can check that out as well if you happen to have an iOS device. Here's all the places that you can reach us. I will also pop those into the chat so that you can sort of take a look at what's going on in the Gray Swan Guild based on how you like to get your information. So I'm going to end this session if there's no other questions or comments. We don't have time, so sorry, I'm going to zip it right there. But before we go, if you have to leave this meeting, I just recommend if you want to save the chat for yourself, we will be recording, the chat will be recorded, but if you want the links in the comments now for yourself to review, down by where you type in your chat, there's a little file image, but if you type the 3 dots beside that, you'll have the option to change, save the chat for yourself. So that's just a little tip for you when you're on calls. If that feature is available, you don't have to be wondering where the chat, when you're going to get to see the chat. All right, so when I put this baton up, that means I'm going to stop recording this session and start recording the next section. And I saw Jill show up. So that means that she's ready. I'm going to stop.